You might guess we're still on our series on giving. And actually, we don't call it giving, we call it generous living, because we believe that that's what God's call is in our life, to freely give back what God has already given us. And we've done this series every January, and there's 3 sermons I wanted to do in this, and I wanted to do it in January, so I threw Kirby in the fire last week and told him he had to start the series. But I understand there was a great message and great spirit here in the service. But each year that we've done this series, we've offered a 30-day money-back guarantee on your tithe. And I know that sounds like a gimmick, but we're really actually very serious about offering that. It says in Malachi 3:10 that bring in the whole tithe into the storehouse. And that if we would do that, that God would bless us so much that we wouldn't even be able to receive all that God gives us in blessing. So this is the area that God allows us to test Him on. And so we want to invite you to take 30 days and begin to tithe if you haven't started yet. And try that tithe for 30 days. And at the end of those 30 days, if you feel that God has not blessed you, or you feel that you've been manipulated by us, or for whatever reason it didn't work out, you can ask for that money back. No questions asked, no judgment on our part. This is simply between you and God. So we invite you to do that and to take that step if you're willing to do it. The reason that we do this series each year is to remind ourselves that what we have is not our own, that we are stewards of what God gives us. We don't do this series every January because we need more money, because our coffers aren't quite full enough, or we're not getting paid enough, or any of those things. It has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with those things. I just believe with all my heart that even though generous living requires some sacrifice, which is what we're going to talk about today, the sacrifice of generosity, that there is really no thing that is more right in us than we are giving back all that God has given us. When we're living in that generous lifestyle where we say, God, this is yours, it's not mine. You allow me to steward it, you allow me to spend it in certain ways, but it's yours, and I can willingly offer it back to you. To be generous is really just to form the habit of giving to God and giving to others without expecting anything in return. How many of you know what your top 5 strengths are? You don't have to name them, but you've gone through the assessment and you know what your 5 strengths are. You know, and when we teach on our strengths, we say that those are the things that come most naturally to us. We don't have to try to do them. They naturally come out of us because those are the strengths that we have. Generosity may be something that we have to develop over time, but it will become eventually a strength. They don't list it in the Clifton Strengths Finder, but it will become natural to us, just like our strengths are, as we continue to learn to live in that lifestyle of generosity and as we learn to give our lives over to God. To be greedy means to take our fair share and more. To be generous means to give our fair share and more. To be greedy, it's like a fire that just consumes everything in its path. Generosity is more like a candle. Now, the candle does have a flame and it does consume a certain amount of oxygen and wax, but it gives back more than it takes. And the beauty of the candle and the sense of the candle is worth much more than a little amount of oxygen and wax that it consumes. Greed comes from fear. To say, I don't think there's going to be enough to go around. Generosity is the confidence, or we would call it faith, that God has plenty for all of us and for all of our needs. Anybody recognize the name Jackie Mason? He was a stand-up comic in 50s, 60s, is what I understand. I hadn't heard of him before I read this quote, but I did a little search on him. He said that I have enough money to last me the rest of my life, unless I buy something. Because it's usually not so much about what we have is usually more about how we spend it, right? What we choose to spend our money on. If you want to turn to Mark chapter 12 in your Bible source, we're going to look at a story there today about a widow who certainly didn't have any money even to survive on, definitely not any money to give away, and yet she gave away all that she had, and God blessed her far beyond the blessing that He gave people that gave much more money than she did. Mark chapter 12, we're going to start in verse 41. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." I want to talk to you about a few things related to that story. First of all, Jesus is interested in our giving. Jesus took time out of his schedule, whatever it was, to stop, to sit down, to observe this moment in time. He was interested in it. You know, Jesus talked about money more than he did any other subject. It's something that interests him as it relates to our lives. And so if it interests him, it's something that we need to pay attention to. But I want to encourage you here, because as soon as I say, God's watching, we start to run for cover, right? And I'm kind of like, I'm watching you. You better make sure you're putting that check in the offering plate. I'm standing over your shoulder as you write that check, so make sure you write it out for 10%. But that is not the picture that I have of God watching us or of Jesus being interested in what we give. I believe that Jesus is encouraging us to make that shift from this is what I have to do, this is what my obligation is, to this is what I freely give out of generosity because you have given me so much, God. I believe that He's cheering us on. I believe that He wants to teach us in this area, but also give us the freedom and the joy that comes with it, which is next Sunday's sermon, the joy of giving. I believe that as Jesus teaches us to be generous, as He watches on, it's because He knows that if we can get past the hump of giving our finances back to God, that we can so much more easily give the other areas of our lives. Finances is usually the hardest one to give up. It's something, that tight-fisted syndrome. We just want to hang on to what we have. We earned it. We deserve it. It's our money. But when we learn to give it over to God. And I believe that even if you're not there yet, maybe you're still taking some baby steps. Maybe it's not the full tithe yet. Maybe it's just kind of here and there. I believe that Jesus is still cheering you on. He's still saying you can do this. You're going to find something different. You're going to find something better when you begin to do this. In 2 Corinthians, Paul was encouraging the church in Corinth. Paul was raising an offering for the church in Jerusalem, which was very poor at that time. And Paul said to the believers in Corinth, "And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave it as much as they were able and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people, and they exceeded our expectations." He's explaining a life of generosity of those people. Not just giving what was expected, not just giving what they thought they could do, but they went well beyond Paul's expectation, well beyond their ability to just do it on their own, and they trusted in God for that. There's something about the sacrifice of giving that produces the joy of generosity in us. There's something about the sacrifice of generosity that produces that lifestyle of generosity. I'm convinced that if we only give out of our riches, which means really we only give out of what we think we can afford, then we aren't really developing that lifestyle of generosity. We're just doing the minimum of what we do. But God calls us to dig deep inside and to give because He has blessed us so greatly. Kirby said in his sermon last week, he sent me the transcript of it so I could read over it and make sure I wasn't saying something that contradicted with him or something. But he had a great statement here, many of them I'm sure, but this one really stuck out to me. He said stewardship, and I'm just calling it generosity, is not always easy. It's often much fun to give out of our wealth or to serve out of the ease of our time. But the motivation of faithfulness must often operate out of our poverty and our busyness. We can give out of our wealth, whatever your wealth is. None of us probably call ourselves wealthy, but we can give a little bit off the top and move on with our life, and it's whatever. But it's when we begin to give out of our poverty, out of what we really can't afford, or the busyness of our time when we don't have time to give, that lifestyle of generosity begins to develop in us. Why does God call us to be generous? Because He was so generous with us. Jesus set the example of ultimate generosity. In that same scripture in 2 Corinthians in verse 9, Paul says, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though He was rich, yet for your sakes He became poor, so that you, through His poverty, might become rich." Isn't that amazing? The generosity of God, that Jesus gave up His God qualities, that He made Himself nothing, that He became sin for us so that we could live in right relationship with the Father. That is absolute generosity, and that's what He calls us to. Now, my father-in-law, Jerry, is one of the most generous people that I know. I mean, he in fact, we were driving yesterday, and we were having what I thought was a fairly humorous conversation about Jerry's giving habits. And Phyllis said, "I can't give him cash anymore because he just gives it away." And so she's the one kind of, she has to do the books, so she's the one kind of trying to settle him down a little bit, and he's the one giving it all away. I'm convinced that God sees pleasure in that. That He is even maybe saying, "I love it when you give out of what you don't have, rather than giving out of what you have." But when God's not watching, when God is watching, but we aren't giving, does that mean we need to run for cover? Does that mean we're about to be judged? Here's what I believe about that. I don't believe that God is our judge in these New Testament times, in these end times. God is not our judge. God is calling us to something better. Now, He will be our judge. When Christ returns, when we stand before the judgment seat, we will be judged. In this life now, God is not judging us, but He's trying to help us see what we are missing by not living in the ultimate plan that He has for us. So if you're not giving, or you're not giving what you think you should, or whatever it is, I don't want you to sit there and feel guilty. What I want you to realize is what you're missing by not living that life of generosity. It's not about God pounding you on the head saying, "You've got to do this." It's about God saying, "You can live a better life. You can live a better way when your finances are given over to me. Because that's how I created you to live. That's how you can see my pleasure, and you can find joy, and you can find fulfillment in your life." I think He's saying, "Come on, you can do this. Trust me in this. Test me in this." So Jesus is interested in our giving. However, Jesus is not interested in how much we give. And that day, when Jesus was telling that story, the offering baskets weren't passed down the rows like we do it today. There was a central place of a container that the offerings went in, and people would go by and they would put their offering in that container, and then they would go on. But something about that practice started to go awry, and I think it's part of why Jesus was motivated to say in Matthew chapter 6, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. See, the issue was in that day, the container that they put the offering plate in, they say was most likely brass. And so it says in verse 41 that many rich people threw in large amounts. Well, the currency of that day was mostly coins. And so somebody who was rich or who had more than others, he would gather his coins and he would go by the container and he would literally throw those coins into the container to make as much noise as possible so that people would, wow, who was that gave all of that money to the offering? And so they began to make it conspicuous about how much they were giving. And Jesus was not impressed. I think even if those same people would have taken all of their coins and they would have gently put them in the container, Jesus still wouldn't have been impressed. Because the story was not about how much they were giving. The story was about the sacrifice of the widow. And the sacrifice of the widow, even though she only gave 2 small coins, was much greater than the sacrifice of all the others that gave that day. The amount the widow gave, it says 2 very small copper coins worth only a fraction of a penny. That offering really had no effect on the temple treasury. It didn't make them poorer, but it didn't really make the treasury any richer. It was almost nothing. And yet Jesus took that offering and set it out as an example for us to see from his time all the way to his return, to show the example of what a generous life was all about. The amount you give is not what's important. The important is the motivation behind why you give. I know that there are some of you who were not able to give very much to our building pledges to pay off the land last year. And some of you even said to me, I just feel terrible that I wasn't able to give more than I was able to give because it seems like my little bit didn't really make any difference. But if we look at this story, we see that the offering that you gave out of sacrifice was at least as important, if not more important, than the person who gave the most to pay off the land. Because it was given out of your poverty. It was given out of sacrifice, not out of plenty. Now, the person who gave the most, who I don't know who that is, may have given out of sacrifice also. It's not about the amount. It's about the motivation behind why we give. So Jesus is interested in our giving. He's not interested in how much it is. But Jesus is moved by our sacrifice. You have to imagine that Jesus, who was God in the flesh here on earth, looking around, seeing all of these needs, probably Jesus feeling the pressure of, what, Holy Spirit, tell me, where do I need to go? What do I need to do? Because there were so many people that needed to be healed. There were so many people that needed to be freed. There were so many points of teaching that he wanted to share. And yet at that moment, when that widow came by, God stopped and noticed. It moved him. Jesus stopped and sat down and watched. I can imagine in my mind, as that widow was stepping up, for God the Father to say to the angels, stop what you're doing. Look at what this widow's doing. Look at how much she loves me. She's not giving because the Jewish tradition says I have to give it. She was giving it out of love and out of sacrifice because she so adored the Father. And God stopped and noticed and was moved by it. You know, we have thousands of excuses as to why we can't give or why we don't give sacrificially. And most of those excuses are based on fear. We worry about a lot of things. Americans spend a lot of time preparing for the future. We have our retirement funds, we have our 401ks, we do a lot of planning for our future. Jerry used to say to Rhonda and I, bologna now, steak later. The only problem was Jerry was eating bologna then, and he's eating bologna now because he kept giving all his money away. But I know for certain that their lives, even though they don't have as much to retire on, their lives are more fulfilled and blessed because they give, rather than if they would have kept it all, been greedy with it, and had more money in their retirement years. You never hear them complain about how little money they have, because they know that God has blessed them beyond measure in many other ways, and He cares for their needs day to day. He is my living example of how to live a generous life. When we spend too much time preparing for the future, because I'm not saying we shouldn't prepare for the future. We should. We have retirement accounts. We should put money in those. But when those things and our plans for the future become more important than what God is doing in our lives, then we're living on dangerous ground and we're missing the blessing. I mean, how often does it happen that people put the money away? How many people do you know in 2008 when the stock market crashed, lost almost everything they had? Those things happen. A scam comes along and you lose every penny that you earned. You saved all of this money, but now in your retirement years, your medical bills are so high that money was gone before you ever noticed it. We're not as secure as we think we are. Plan, save, but don't put your trust in those things. Put your trust in God. Because Paul said in Philippians 4:19 that God will supply all of our needs according to His riches in Christ Jesus. The opposite of that is what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes. Whoever loves money never has enough money. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. See, we say sometimes, I will be generous when I can afford to be. And what we find is we'll never afford it because it's not about what we have, it's about our priorities regarding what we have and how much we demand to keep on our own. The sacrifice of generosity is scary, isn't it? Giving beyond what we think our checking account or our budget sheet says. The speaker at our pastor's spouse retreat last week, Dan Spade, I'm not sure if he said this or if he quoted it from another book, but I really liked what he said. The things I really want are often superseded by the things I want. The things I really want are often superseded by the things I want. I really want to be generous. I really want to live in that generous lifestyle. But I want that new car. I want that nice house. I want that retirement account. And those things begin to supersede what in my heart I really want. I want to just illustrate real quickly the way God's riches work. Because when God says that He will supply all of our riches according to His glory, then he's talking about things that aren't going to line up for us. We're going to look at our checkbook and we're going to say, that can't happen. But this paper represents just our financial picture. So we know what we owe, we know what our income is, we know how much we give, we know, just the basic things of the finances. And so this penny just represents us and our checkbook and what we can afford to do. And that penny slides through that hole real nicely. But sometimes some things come along that are just a little bit more difficult. That's represented by this nickel. And that nickel, well, yeah, it'll go through that hole, but not as easily as the penny does. We can stretch it out a little bit. We can make it work, but it's not easy for us. And then there comes a time when it's beyond our control. And God has called us to do something big. He's called us to be generous with somebody that's in need. He's called us to do this or that. And we're looking at that and we're saying, there is no way. There is no way. And that's represented by this quarter. And you try to put this quarter through that hole, and it doesn't really want to fit. I actually picked up the wrong paper. And you look at this hole and you look at this quarter. And I'd have to rip the paper in order to make it go through. And the ripping of the paper would represent the disaster of our finances. And I don't think God intends that for us either. I don't think He intends for us to leave bills unpaid. I don't think He intends for us to have to claim bankruptcy and those kinds of things. Sometimes it happens, and God works with us in those things, but I don't think that's His initial plan for us. And so we look at that and we say, there is no way that that's going to happen. But when we submit our finances to God, and we allow Him to do something that is out of His riches and not out of ours, then we begin to see that as we submit it to Him and we rest in Him, that it allows it to come through. Same hole. Quarter didn't go through in my own strength, but in God's riches, in His ways that we don't understand. I don't know why that works. Yeah. So here's our finances. Here's a quarter. If I had a camera, we could do it up close, but you can just see that quarter is not going to fit through there. At our angle, I don't know. I don't see any angle that's going to get it through there. But in God's riches, in God's way of doing things, as we submit our accounts, our desires, our ways to Him, then through His riches, it's able to be paid. Because it's not about our finances. It's about God's riches. It's coming from Him. And you're going to look at it and you're going to say, how did that happen? My checkbook still has a balance in it, and it's not a negative one. My budget sheet says this isn't going to work. And yet somehow, God makes it work. Because it's His riches, not ours. It's His plan, not ours. It's His goodness, not ours. So if we're going to learn to give and learn that lifestyle of generosity, there is sacrifice that comes along with that. But to be able to just sacrifice our money is the ultimate step, but there's some other things that have to be sacrificed in the process. And so one of those things might be your tight-fisted syndrome. It's mine. I can't let go. I've tried, but it's still in my hands. I don't know what to do. Because we haven't really released it. We don't need a generous pill. We need submission. Is what we need. We may need to submit our financial future. Make sure you're hearing me on this. Save money. There's nothing wrong with saving money. But don't make that savings account more important than God's plan. You may need to let go of all of your plans for your financial future. Trust that even though you're giving toward those are not the answer. And those may come or go. But I can trust that God will supply all my needs. You may need to sacrifice things. You may need to sacrifice the things that you want so that you can live with what you really want. And you may just need to sacrifice a selfish will. It's mine, I earned it. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. It's my life. I'm going to live it the way I want. You have the option. You even have the right to say that. But you're missing out on God's blessing when you live that way as opposed to choosing to let God have it all. Not just your finances, but every part of your life. Will you bow your heads with me? I want to invite you to just take a minute on your own and have conversations with God about your life. Is it generous? Is it not? What is your motivation for giving? Is it because the pastor preaches and I start feeling guilty? Or is it because you know that as you give back to God, you're living in the rightness of His kingdom, the way He designed you to live? So will you just take a couple of minutes on your own and have that conversation with God? We don't always apply that song to our giving. It's more often just about other things in our lives. But it's really such a misnomer for us to think that we can compartmentalize our lives and give you one thing and not give another. You call for the wholeness of who we are. And so I pray, Father, that as we consider these things that you're teaching us, that you would take all of us. We say that sometimes the finances is the hardest one to let go of. But there are probably other things in our lives too that we have not fully given over to you. We're asking God that you would take full control over our lives. That you would do in us what you want to do. For your honor and glory. Amen. You know, I know that this topic gets uncomfortable, and I know it forces you to squirm a little bit. It does me too. But this is God's call for us to be fully devoted disciples of Jesus Christ. All of us, not just parts. And so I challenge you to go and to consider these things and do what God calls you to do in your life, not looking around at anybody else or comparing yourself. But what is God saying to you in your life this week? Thank you for being gracious and attentive. I hope you have a great week, Spirit-filled, God-anointed week where it's productive in His kingdom. God bless you. Dismissed.